complicated. You know, man, like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side, and like,
All right, George Bagby, welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I've been driving very hard this holiday weekend, and so I'm kind of recovering from that, but we've got a really good subject today, and I've been really looking forward to it.
Yeah, for those listening in the future, it is New Year's Day, and both Bagby and I are somewhat the worse for wear. In each case, though, it's not because we were up late partying, but I'm stuck with this kind of eternal throat sickness, which you can probably hear. And obviously, Bagby drives a cab, and turns out that New Year's is a pretty busy day for him. So anyway, we'll get into it. So you have recently republished a book, and that book is about our topic today. So, do you want to first introduce our topic and then maybe the book that you've republished as well?
Yes, the topic is the reconstruction of the United States that follows the war between the states, the Civil War. And the book is The Civil War and Reconstruction in Alabama. This is one of many books published by the so-called Dunning School of Civil War historiography. They were all students of a certain professor at Columbia named William A. Dunning, and they all got very deep into the primary sources in their native states and wrote state-specific histories of the Reconstruction period. And these students, the most famous of them, went to the southern states and did their work there. But there were northern state histories that came out of this school of historians as well. These were mostly published around the turn of the century, and they are rather inaccessible. They're extremely good quality because they are compendiums of the sources of the times. They draw very heavily on these primary sources, and that's one of the reasons why they are very durable and valuable. But it's also a very controversial period in American history, and the Dunning School has been purposefully marginalized because they take an older view. Um, it used to be the establishment view of this period of American history, but it's been marginalized and deliberately excluded from the conversation about this period. What's really interesting about this at the moment, like as a contemporary concern, is suddenly these Reconstruction policies and laws are front page news all around the country, mostly because of controversy about the upcoming 2024 presidential election. And these laws, in particular the 14th Amendment, are being used to justify very radical policies in our own time. So it's a curious thing that this old conversation about what happened in American history and what justifies or makes these things unjustifiable, that is now a topic of popular interest once again.
And it's interesting because the two other, and I realize this may be seen as overly broad, but the two other major post war, I guess, kind of social planning operations that the Empire of Lies has embarked on. Well, obviously, there's the denazification, right? What we did to Europe, but the blueprints for that and what is sort of maybe going to come back after the next election. Well, the blueprint of that is found in Reconstruction. So let's start kind of immediately when the hostilities end, uh, as far as the war between the states is concerned. How long does it take between that moment and the start of, I guess, what we would know as Reconstruction? Actually, you know what? Before I get into that, do you want to maybe define what Reconstruction is? Because I realize I have a more international audience than I often say, and so there are perhaps some of us who don't necessarily know their American history.
Sure. Yes. Reconstruction refers to the period after the American Civil War It's a period of military governments in the South, of the imposition of martial law and political policy made by force of arms, not through normal means of consensus and political process, but through military governments and through the intimidation of soldiers in the southern states. And it refers to this period of radical idealism that nominally motivated the Republican Party, which dominated the federal government after the war. This, of course, was Lincoln's party, and the Democrats were marginalized as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion at this time. These were the things that were associated with the Democratic Party. This was back when the Democratic Party was much more interesting and fun than it is now. I really like the legacy of this particular political party. It was associated with the immigrant Catholics, with people that liked alcohol, so anti-prohibition forces, and with the former Confederate states, thereby calling it the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. It sounds like a lot of fun to me, but they were marginalized during this time. Lots of Democratic voters, these are white ex-Confederates in the South, were disenfranchised during this time. Very importantly, and this is probably the number one emphasis in most of the history you'd read on the period today, the slaves were all legally freed by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This is the first of the Reconstruction Amendments. That was the legal end of slavery in the United States. Not the Emancipation Proclamation, but the 13th Amendment in 1865. In 1866, we see the 14th Amendment, which redefines citizenship and also excludes ex-Confederates from voting and holding office. And then finally, you have the 15th Amendment, the last of the Reconstruction Amendments, which guarantees voting rights to all American citizens, regardless of their former status of being slaves. So Reconstruction is this time of the rebuilding of American constitutional government. It's a reforming of Republican institutions, particularly in the South. Republican meaning representative government institutions. And it's a period that was done by force. These reforms were done by force, not through consensus. The constitutions of all the southern states were rewritten during this time. And it was also a time very famous for corruption in high places. Mark Twain famously referred to this period as the Gilded Age. So it looks really glittery on the outside, but on the inside, it's worthless. Gilded. It's an age of corruption in high places. You have probably the most infamous American presidential regimes, like the U.S. Grant regime, which sees the vice president arrested for corruption, the president's personal secretary and several cabinet members all indicted for corruption and the embezzlement of public funds. Even the word lobbyist first comes into use during this period because the Republican regime in Washington, D.C. is handing out huge sums of money to special interest groups during this time. And so the way that the United States government operates fundamentally transforms during this period, and that makes it of particular interest. The civil rights aspect, the end of slavery, the radical sudden enfranchisement with no previous plan of all Black Americans in the South, not in the North. We should specify these reforms that enfranchise Black voters in the South do not initially affect Northern states at all. Not that that matters very much. There are very few Black people living in the North at this time. The vast majority of them live in the South. But that is a huge issue during this period, and that is usually what is focused on.
So let's go through the 3 constitutional amendments and contrast that to how American governance was handled before. Does that sound reasonable?
Sure. And that's very topical for us right now, because the 14th Amendment in particular is very emphasized in our discourse right now. So let me go back to an earlier question you had. Just when did all this Reconstruction begin? Historians start tracking the progress of Reconstruction policies during the war itself. So while the South is being invaded in the course of the Civil War, military regimes are set up around the South. And military governments are established. And Lincoln was always adamant that the Southern states had not left the Union. They remained in the Union. And they were commandeered by rebel factions that did not represent the states that they portended to represent. So Lincoln never recognized that the South had left the Union. He never recognized the legitimacy of the Confederate States or the Confederate government, the Union of the Confederate States. He never recognized them as legitimate bodies. And he said that they were all in conspiracy, in rebellion against the federal government. So when the federal armies went into southern states, they would set up rival Union governments. When they didn't just run things like a military camp. So this happened in several states, and this is an important feature to talk about the Reconstruction Amendments, because it makes sense of several of them. In states where the federal government had a long-standing occupation, states like Tennessee, which was invaded very early, and states like Louisiana, the Union Army established rival state governments in those states. And those governments actually sent representatives to Congress. And these were all Republicans. The most famous instance of that is the future president Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. He was a Democrat. He was a Southerner from the highlands of Tennessee. He was a Unionist. He had the distinction of being the only Southern congressman that did not leave the Capitol when his state seceded from the Union. He did not recognize the right of secession, and so he stayed in the Capitol and became a favorite of Abraham Lincoln, because he was a loyal Southerner, loyal to the Union. So Abraham Lincoln rewarded him by making him vice president on his Republican ticket in 1864 when he ran for re-election. And this, very ironically, after Lincoln is assassinated, makes Andrew Johnson president of the United States, which is the craziest thing following the Civil War. You have a Southern Democrat who is president of the United States immediately following the Civil War. It's the most unlikely accident. Not surprisingly, he does not get along with the radical Republicans and is impeached unsuccessfully. They do not remove him from office. He's acquitted by a single vote. But he's a very important example of these union governments that were set up in these occupied states in the South. Well, immediately after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson is president because he's Lincoln's second vice president. The process of renovating the Union at this point, following the Great American Civil War, where half of the country destroys the other half of the country. The big question of the time is, how is the Union going to work at this point? Previously, the conservative position in antebellum America, in pre-war America, was that the states had formed a consensus about what functions of government the federal government would have. What powers does the federal government have? And they wrote down and agreed upon this consensus, and that is what the Constitution is. So the Constitution is a long list of things the states agree the federal government can and cannot do. And after they wrote down the Constitution, or their representatives wrote it down, it went to the state governments for ratification. And that's the story of all the states of the Union up until the Civil War. After the Civil War, we have this big problem, because it's obvious that there are many more powers in that federal government than people had imagined before. The federal government has waged a war against the states in the name of union, and this was how Lincoln justified his military actions that began the war. Now, Lincoln added further justifications as the war progressed. Most famously, he said the war was going to end slavery, and that the war was justified because it would end slavery. He very famously alludes to this in the Gettysburg Address, and then states it much more plainly in the second inaugural address. But if we read the first inaugural address, he is very careful to skirt the issue of slavery. He says that he isn't doing anything in regards to slavery and doesn't think that he has any right to do so. But by the time we get to April of 1865, Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse. The other Confederate armies are in a hopeless condition. They quickly surrender. The question is, what sort of government does the United States have at this point? President Andrew Johnson, is marginalized. He has his ideas about how to bring the Union together post-war. Andrew Johnson seems to illustrate Abraham Lincoln's conciliatory ideas about restoring the Union. Andrew Johnson stays up all night long signing pardons for ex-Confederates who write to him asking for the restoration of their citizenship rights. Andrew Johnson tells the ex-Confederate states that all they need to do is send representatives back to Washington, D.C., and they are restored to their status in the Union. But this runs into problems. Congress at this point is dominated by the Republican Party. The southern states, the former Confederate states, were the major Democratic stronghold in the South. They were the stronghold of the Democratic Party. When they left the Union, they withdrew their congressional representatives. All except Andrew Johnson left. So Congress, from the moment of the secession of the southern states, has been overwhelmingly dominated by Lincoln's Republican Party. And through the course of the war, this party becomes very radicalized and very antagonistic against the South. Not surprisingly, because it's a war, right? They feel very bitter towards the South. And their people are encouraging them in this. It is a reflection of popular sentiment, more or less. Andrew Johnson's conciliatory attitude, just as Abraham Lincoln's conciliatory attitude towards the end of the war, Lincoln was famous for saying, with malice towards none and charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. He's known for saying these very nice and soothing things about the Union following the war. Andrew Johnson seems to be working that out, and that is very unpopular in Congress. So Congress does a couple of things here. Well, Congress starts doing a great number of things, but most importantly, they decide they are going to run the restoration of the Union out of Congress, and they are going to get around the president's conciliatory policies towards the South. The Republican leadership in Congress is very close with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who is Lincoln's Secretary of War, not surprisingly, Lincoln's last and most effective Secretary of War. He is a radical Republican, Edwin Stanton, and he starts disobeying the orders of President Johnson. President Johnson tells Edwin Stanton that Southerners are to hold elections, that these ex-Confederates are allowed to reform their state governments, to hold constitutional conventions. The idea is that these ex-Confederate states need to repudiate their former Confederate constitution and rejoin the Union, ratify the Philadelphia Constitution once again, and rejoin the Union. Edwin Stanton is commanding the army, and he's sending out the orders to all the Southern generals, and he is actively subverting the political process in the Southern states at this point. So Andrew Johnson attempts to remove Edwin Stanton from office, and Edwin Stanton refuses to leave and is backed up by his allies in Congress. Then the president's enemies in the Republican Congress, they pass articles to impeach the president for attempting to remove a cabinet officer, for attempting to remove Edwin Stanton from office. Now, that is a remarkable and crazy episode. Andrew Johnson was wanting to appoint Ulysses S. Grant as Secretary of War to replace Stanton, and Grant is the most popular man in America at this point. He's the victor of the army, right? He couldn't have picked a more popular fellow to take this position, and yet Edwin Stanton barricaded himself in his office to resist removal and gets backed up by these really wild anti-Southern Republicans in Congress. Congress then decides that they're going to impeach the president. They very, very narrowly fail on that point. But then they start imposing very strict terms on the South, very punitive terms on the Southern states. Firstly, the Republicans turn away the representatives sent to Congress by the Southern states. Not surprisingly, these are people that were voted on by these ex-Confederate Democrats in the South, and the Southerners vote Alexander Stephens to be the senator from Georgia, for instance. Alexander Stephens was the former vice president of the Confederate States and a notable statesman from pre-war Georgia. Well, he's the leader of these people. These people are voting for their wartime leaders to lead them after the war. They vote ex-Confederate generals into Congress. And these men show up in Washington, D.C., and are barred from entry into the Capitol by the Republicans. The Republicans in Congress declare that there are no legal governments in the Southern states. And they declare martial law throughout the South. And this is getting around the president's authority with the Secretary of War. The Secretary of War isn't answering to the president with all of this. He's answering to radical leaders in Congress. So this is not the way that the American government was designed to work, but this is how it is working effectually during this time. Now, at the exact same time, taking the long way around to your original question, what about these Reconstruction Amendments? At the exact same time these things are going on in Washington, D.C., we have these major constitutional questions. This big crisis is brewing. The Southern state governments are ratifying the 13th Amendment to the Constitution at this time. Now, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution is the amendment that formally abolishes the institution of slavery. Every Southern state abolishes the institution of slavery. There's one weird exception when it comes to the 13th Amendment. The state of Mississippi does not ratify the 13th Amendment, but they do write a new state constitution which abolishes slavery. So it's not as if they're trying desperately to hold on to slavery at the end of the Civil War. It's just a different way of doing it. And they don't want to be strong-armed into ratifying amendments to the Constitution down there in Mississippi. So they do it their own way. But every Southern state abolishes slavery, and this is through their representative governments. At the exact same time, the radicals in the Republican-led Congress in D.C. say there are no legal governments in the South. And that justifies their treatment as conquered territory to be administered by martial law. And this is one of the very many reasons why Reconstruction is a maddening period to study. It is a very frustrating period. It is a very confusing period because legally this doesn't make sense. It's not a time that it's not a time where anyone can justify what's going on. No one can make sense of what's going on or how it all makes sense constitutionally, even if you were trying to take the side of the radical Republicans. You have to admit that they are going far beyond the law to do all of these things. So in the South at this time, the slaves have been declared free. This is certainly the most important result of the American Civil War, the end of slavery. I do not dispute this. This was a huge social, economic, and political change in the United States. But there are a lot of other things going on at this time as well. Just to give you an example, a wartime example, but it still fits. One of the things that I'm doing right now is I'm giving Civil War tours in the French Quarter in New Orleans. Occasionally, I have some people, and I give them this tour. And one of the stories that I tell is how the Union Army arrived in New Orleans and declared Confederate currency void. This shut down the banks in New Orleans. Everyone was using Confederate currency, and this was declared not legal tender when the Union arrives. Then the Union publicizes that Congress has declared the confiscation of all rebel property. This is one of the things that the Republicans do when they take over Congress in 1862. The Confiscation Act of 1862 declares anyone in arms against the United States government has forfeited their property rights, and their property may be seized and auctioned. And this is one of the original things that's used to justify the manumission of slaves. So people who own slaves who are in arms in the Confederate States have forfeited their property rights to their slaves. Some Union generals take that act to mean this and declare the emancipation of slaves in military districts based on this law. But down in New Orleans, what this meant was General Butler, the Union general in New Orleans, warns the people of New Orleans that they have to take oaths to be loyal to President Lincoln and to the Union, or the military authorities could seize everything that they own. And there are lines outside of the Army headquarters in New Orleans for people to come in and take the oath with their hand on the Bible that they will be loyal to Lincoln and his government. And not surprisingly, the people with the most to lose, the wealthy, the merchant class, are the ones most tempted to go and take this oath to safeguard what they own. The women of the city, which are the majority of the people in the city at this time, most of the able-bodied men are off at war at this time. The women of the city come and berate the men that stand in line to take this oath. They call them cowards, and there's this very emotional exchange. It's this very sad thing to imagine. But one of the things that follows is that General Butler goes around New Orleans seizing the property of ex-Confederates. He seizes the property of Confederate generals, Confederate officers, people that he knows are in arms, and he can use newspapers as evidence for this, that they are in command in posts outside of the city, and he starts seizing their property. And according to the military law, and according to the martial law, it is auctioned off. Now, this presents a big problem because Confederate currency has been outlawed. So unless you have a signed loyalty oath, which safeguards your property rights, and you have a lot of gold and silver coin, or some other source of wealth that's liquid and exchangeable, you have no ability to participate in the auctions that follow from the seized property. So General Butler auctions off seized Confederate property around New Orleans, and he turns up to the auctions himself and wins a lot of these auctions and sends the movable property back to Boston, where he was from. And he leaves New Orleans after a tenure of only 9 months. General Butler leaves New Orleans a multimillionaire. And this is all arguably legal under martial law. After the end of the war, this is happening throughout the South, not just in the great city of New Orleans. It's something that's happening everywhere. After the war, 25% of the able-bodied men of the South have died. A whole quarter of the military age male population is dead. Another quarter is wounded or maimed. Lots of them with missing limbs. A whole 20% of the farms in the South in 1865 have been abandoned. And this is very surprising when we think of the death toll, right, and the proportion of men lost in battle. There simply aren't enough men around to save the farms, to do anything with them, to even make them livable or habitable, and so they are abandoned. A huge proportion of the population is reduced to penury and even made into refugees, dependent on friends and family elsewhere. At the exact same time in 1865, when federal authority is enforced throughout the South, the federal government imposes 4 years of back taxes on the South. So the Southerners said, well, we are an independent country. We've seceded from the Union. We aren't paying taxes to the federal government. When the federal government came back, they imposed punitive taxes and back taxes on all of the Southerners and told them to pay up. And when they couldn't pay, they seized their property. So a huge amount of property around the southern states went to the auction block for back taxes. This caused property values to plummet throughout the South. In some states, this was particularly bad. In places like Mississippi, 1/5 of the state was auctioned off for back taxes. A whole fifth of the state was put to auction because the people there could not pay the taxes after the war. Uh, it's difficult to explain just how utterly destroyed the South was in the years after the war. I have a quote here to illustrate this. A Massachusetts journalist, his name was Sidney Adams. He made a tour through southern states in 1865. And he said, you can only get over the roads walled by desolation. He described Charleston, South Carolina as a city of ruins, of desolation, of vacant houses, of widowed women, of rotting wharves, deserted warehouses, of wild gardens, of miles of grass-grown streets. A British traveler who visited Tennessee wrote that the area consists for the most part of plantations in a state of semi-ruin. The trail of war is visible throughout the valley in burnt-up gin houses, ruined bridges, mills, and factories, and of large tracts of once cultivated land stripped of every vestige of fencing. One of the things that we should remember when we're talking about this period of Reconstruction, it is a time that is cunningly labeled because we know that war is so destructive. But Reconstruction is not the rebuilding of the United States. It is not the restoration of what was lost. It is not recompense or effort made to restore things that were destroyed. It was not the rebuilding of the country. Reconstruction was the rebuilding of the way our country's institutions worked. It was a radical tinkering with the fundamental laws of the country, and it was done by force. It was done by military government. Well, I've been talking here for a long time. I hope I haven't overworn myself.
No, not at all. It's interesting you bring up that kind of the fatal irony of that phrase, Reconstruction, because buried within this is one, there's part of it that's just base looting, and maybe we can get into the rise of organizations like the Klan, why that arose kind of in reaction to that. But there's another level of it, right? Which is this idea that you see again in the Morgenthau Plan, or the Marshall Plan, what is kind of teased in, their wildest dreams about MAGA is this idea that essentially they know better. They can reconstruct, certain ideas, certain proclivities out of people, and that society can be remade in their image. And to a certain degree, they were successful. I would argue in the case of Reconstruction, they were very, very unsuccessful, right? It went poorly. It was ended early. But it is this kind of like megalomaniacal desire to remake other societies. Like, say what you will, but there's something kind of honest about pre-modern war, right? It's either, kind of an internecine thing between, different factions, in which case it's a political struggle, or if it's a war between different peoples, it might not be pretty, it might not be nice, but it's understandable and kind of an animal level, right? Different packs of wolves fight, so Roman Carthage fights. But something like this, whereas there's this layer of social engineering, I find it very distasteful.
Absolutely. And that's a good transition to the so-called civil rights aspect of this period. So as I've admitted, the end of slavery is the single most important result of the American Civil War. And the fact that it was done by violence and by force, not by political process. That this is a very important distinction. Every country in the world that abolished slavery did it through a political process. That means they talked about it. Everyone's concerns were taken into account. There were compromises made to accommodate concerns. There was a plan. People were thinking about how this was going to play out, and it was executed through a political process according to that country's traditions, whatever it was. Okay, this is how Turkey did it. This is how Brazil did it. This is how Great Britain did it. The United States was the only country in the world to abolish slavery. Perhaps I should say Haiti abolished slavery by violence rather than by political process and consensus. And it was done without any consideration for the future, what was going to happen afterwards. That is a very important thing to remember about this process. So back to congressional reconstruction. I find myself talking about the state of the South after the war and kind of the practical results of the war. The fact that every bank failed, the fact that no one had any money at precisely the moment that the country became a free labor economy. The irony of this is overwhelming, right? Everyone's supposed to have wages now, and no one has any money and no one can get any money. And the country has been decimated, and a quarter of the white men are dead. Right? This is really, really bad. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons why Northerners who came south with money at this time, the so-called carpetbaggers, are an extremely important group of people. They had a political voice in a time when white Southerners were excluded from the political process. They had money when no one else had money. They were disproportionately important in every way. And if it had not been for the carpetbaggers, the so-called carpetbaggers that came from the northern states into the South immediately after the war, the Reconstruction period would have been far worse. I mean that there would have been terrible famine. Many people would have been dead from famine and suffering in other ways. The carpetbaggers served a very important economic role, even if they're condemned for their political role. And we can understand why they were resented, but nevertheless, I think they're a very important group. I find myself talking about those things with more ease, but we do need to turn back to congressional reconstruction. At the same time, the Congress is insisting that no legal governments exist in the South, and they use this to declare martial law throughout the South and the occupation of the South by the Union armies, who police the voters, intimidate the voters, encourage the newly freed slaves to participate in politics while they are excluding all of the former white citizens from the political process. This is very This is all a huge social experiment. And it has an effect of pitting the races against one another and breeding lots of resentments. We can understand how that would work. At the same time they are doing this, Congress insists that Southern legislatures, which they say have no authority, should rewrite their state constitutions with Republican committees in charge. The Democrats have practically been outlawed in the South. They have been so marginalized through disenfranchisement in particular, even though the Democrats in the South, the Democratic Party leaders, take special pains to appoint as their official leadership the men of those states who were always against secession and on the sidelines of the Civil War. Naturally enough, we can say those were not their natural leaders, that those were not the people they wanted in charge of their institutions. They were just the only men around who stood any chance to make an argument to the radical Republican Congress that the Democratic Party of the Southern states was at all legitimate to be participating in politics at all. Even though they did those things, they were still being excluded. So the radical Republicans say that all the Southern states have to rewrite their constitutions. This happens in places like South Carolina and Alabama, for instance. This happens with committees of Republican politicians who come from the North or are collaborator Southerners who declare for the Republican Party, or they are newly enfranchised blacks from that state, or blacks that come from elsewhere in the country. And they are put in charge of rewriting those state constitutions. The Democratic committees in those states file complaints to Congress saying this is very lopsided, this is very unfair. You have taken a very small minority of our population. If you think back just a few years, in Lincoln's original election in 1860, there was no Republican Party in the Southern states. Abraham Lincoln did not receive a single vote in the states that joined the Confederate States. It wasn't as if Lincoln was an unpopular candidate by our standards in American history. There was no organization for the Republican Party in those states, and he did not receive a single vote in those states. He was seen as such an alien candidate, so far removed from the concerns of those voters. But now that political party is reforming the basic political institutions of these states for their own benefit. The radical Republicans in Congress then pass on to the Southern states. At the same time, they say there are no legal institutions in these states. They hand them an amendment to the Constitution. They hand them the famous 14th Amendment to the Constitution with a threat. Congress, the Republicans in Congress, tell the Southern states in 1866, ratify the 14th Amendment, or you will have no representation in Congress. And a number of Southern states try to hold out on this, even with a lot of Republicans in charge in these Southern states. Several of these states decide they are going to withhold consideration of the 14th Amendment because the way that it is forced on them with a blackmail threat, we will not permit you to have Republican institutions, representative government. Not even a shadow of it. With all the disenfranchisement that's gone on, and the enfranchisement that has gone on in these states in this short period of time, we won't let you have it unless you ratify a constitutional amendment. It makes no sense. Are they part of the Union, or did they actually leave the Union? Lincoln said they never left the Union. President Johnson said they never left the Union. They just need to send representation back to Congress, and they've been restored as states in the Union. The radical Republicans forwarded a theory to justify their behavior that when the states seceded from the Union, they committed political suicide and ceased to exist as bodies, as legal bodies. And this was their justification to treat these southern states as conquered territory, which was basically what they were. They declared them military districts during this time. Yet, at the same time, they're demanding that they ratify amendments to the Constitution. The only bodies that can ratify amendments to the Constitution are states of the Union. So they're trying to have it both ways. The government of Florida in 1866 wrote, a resolution of the Florida House of Representatives. They said, "Beyond the postal service, our people derive no benefit from our existence as a state of the Union. We are denied representation even when we elect a man who never sympathized with the Confederacy's rebellion. We are at the same time subject to the most onerous taxation, and our civil law is enforced only when it meets the approval of the local military commanders." Now, that was their reason to not consider the 14th Amendment. But Congress decided to drag this out as long as it took to ratify the 14th Amendment, and eventually the southern states did. And this is part of the process of Reconstruction. It was a process of threats, of blackmail, of cynical looting, of the enfranchisement of certain populations. Not the Indians, by the way. The 14th Amendment deliberately excludes the Indians from citizenship. That comes later, all right? But enfranchising the Black population to make them a loyal bloc of the Republican Party, of Lincoln's party, and to make the Republican Party the dominant party of the United States in perpetuity. This was what the Republican leadership in Washington, D.C. openly avowed as their goals in this time. They also, some of the more extreme members, people like Benjamin Butler, the former Union commander in New Orleans, now United States Senator in Massachusetts, or from Massachusetts. Benjamin Butler is one of Andrew Johnson's greatest enemies in the impeachment. Benjamin Butler is one of the leaders of the radical Republicans in Congress during Reconstruction. Others like Thaddeus Stevens of Massachusetts, who has a big role prior to the Civil War, very famously beaten over the head by South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks for insulting family members in speeches on the floor of Congress. Thaddeus Stevens is another one of these very harsh antagonists of the Southern people. And let's see. I might be getting this wrong. Did I say Thaddeus Stevens
I
was
believe
from?
so. Yes.
Okay, Thaddeus. I'm getting this wrong. Thaddeus Stevens was a congressman from Pennsylvania. I'm getting that wrong. Who am I thinking of?
I'm the wrong person to ask. We're entirely too far in the weeds for my knowledge of American
I'm
history. I'm
sorry.
sorry.
I'm forgetting this the senator from Massachusetts. He's just slipped my mind. Thaddeus Stevens. Let me refresh my statement on that. Thaddeus Stevens said that he wanted to see the South depopulated of white Southerners. He wanted to force them to immigrate. So you have from people like Thaddeus Stevens, who is a very peculiar character. Evidently had a long affair with a black woman. Really peculiar fellow. Very spiteful fellow. I don't want to do him. I don't want to malign him unfairly. But he had a reputation, even among his admirers, of being very bitter towards his enemies. Okay, but Thaddeus Stevens, saying that the southern states should be ethnically cleansed, and the property there redistributed to loyal freedmen. Those are the newly enfranchised Black Americans, and Union soldiers as war booty. Um, even taking like a Roman view of of the southern states as conquered provinces, uh, with all their wealth to be redistributed as plunder. This happened on a certain scale, but that was not actually how Reconstruction took place, I should say. Thaddeus Stevens did not get everything that he wanted. Um, but these radicals in Congress, they force the 14th Amendment on the southern states, and the southern legislatures, in desperation, eventually ratify the most controversial amendment to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment. So let's get into the details of the 14th Amendment. It's the longest amendment in the Constitution. Uh, I should say first. It is the most complicated. It has several sections to it, and it has been used to justify a great many of the most controversial things in constitutional law in the United States. It has been used to justify um, the elimination of laws regulating abortion in the states. Roe versus Wade used the 14th Amendment to justify striking down all laws prohibiting abortion in the United States. It was used to justify um, Lawrence versus Texas, which struck down all laws prohibiting or criminalizing sodomy in the United States. It was used to justify Obergefell versus Hodges, which struck down all state laws uh, regulating the definition of marriage, proclaiming marriage to be a uh, institution between a man and a woman. It's been used for all of these controversial Supreme Court cases, these major culture war cases, if you will, because the first part of the 14th Amendment limits what state governments can do. It gives the federal government power to strike down things that state governments have done in law. And if you note, the Supreme Court cases that I mentioned all have to do with striking down state laws. It is the Supreme Court striking down state laws. What we call the incorporation of the Bill of Rights, the application of constitutional limitations to state governments. The 14th Amendment applies federal power to state governments. Now, if you recall, towards the beginning of our investigation, I said that in antebellum America, the conservative view, if you will, was that the states came together to decide what powers their common federal government might have over them, what powers they would cede to a general government. And those powers were all listed in the Constitution, the Philadelphia Constitution. The Constitution then went back to the state legislatures for ratification, and there was debate about that. The Constitution was then further defined by the Bill of Rights, which followed the ratification of the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights are another long list of things that the federal government can and cannot do. Summarized with the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, the 10th Amendment, the last of the Bill of Rights, says that anything not explicitly listed in the Constitution is reserved to the states. The 14th Amendment turns this on its head. And this is one of the reasons why the 14th Amendment is such a consequential and important amendment. The 14th Amendment says the federal government regulates what state governments can do. The 10th Amendment says the exact opposite. Now, the 10th Amendment was never repealed, but the South's defeat in 1865 has sealed the fate and interpretation of the 10th Amendment. People still talk about the 10th Amendment these days, but I think they forget about 1865 when they talk about it. I think the question was settled back then. And it doesn't mean that I'm happy about that or anything. Okay. I'm just saying that that's the way it has worked out. Okay. And that doesn't mean it's the end of the story. We still have these things in our law, and we still think about them and care about them, and maybe we'll do something with them. I'm not here to say that, but okay. So that's what the 14th Amendment did. It says, no state shall make or enforce any law that shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All right, that is the really famous statement in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment that applies federal laws to the states. All right. The Bill of Rights has the exact opposite formulation. The Bill of Rights very famously says, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, so on and so forth. All right. The 14th Amendment says no state shall make or enforce any law. And the federal government decides which laws. That's why that has become so consequential. The Supreme Court decides what due process means. The states don't have any say in that. That's why state laws get shot down by the Supreme Court.
Is this really the moment in which the kind of true final seat of power in American governance becomes the Supreme Court, or was that going on before?
There was a lot of argument about that before. Before the 14th Amendment, state governments would defy the Supreme Court. One funny instance of that, there was a Supreme Court case that said the Bank of the United States had the ability to operate in any state, and states could not say no to the Bank of the United States. It was McCulloch versus Maryland. This is a very early Supreme Court case that federal law trumps state law. All right. It's a very important early Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland. There was a law passed by the state of Ohio. I like these northern states that stand out in constitutional history, because I love to point out it's not just southern states that are always defying the federal government on this stuff. Northern states did it too. It was an American thing. We used to have more in common on that. the state of Ohio passed a law taxing the Bank of the United States. This was precisely the issue that was at stake in McCulloch versus Maryland. The state of Maryland had passed a tax against the federal corporation, the Bank of the United States. The idea back then was the federal government did not have the constitutional authority to set up corporations. All right. It shows a difference between our world and theirs. We kind of take corporations for granted. We can hardly imagine our lives without these huge federally chartered corporations everywhere, all protected by the Bill of Rights. Remember Mitt Romney? Corporations are people, my friend. We can hardly imagine our world without that. But back then, states actually tried to keep them out. They didn't want wealth and power concentrated in New York City or whatever. So Maryland taxed the Bank of the United States, and that was declared void by the Supreme Court in McCulloch versus Maryland. Well, later on, the state of Ohio decided they would tax the Bank of the United States in Ohio. And so they sent the tax collectors down to the Bank of the United States branch and presented the bill. And the Bank of the United States, filled with a bunch of smug federal people, they're like, oh, the Supreme Court. And the authorities of Ohio sent down safecrackers, and they busted open the bank vaults in the Bank of the United States and cleared it out as taxes. And the thing shut down. And it reminds you of the famous line from President Andrew Jackson. The Supreme Court has made its ruling. Let's see them enforce it. All right. Just because the Supreme Court made a ruling and it is seen as constitutional law did not mean that states would obey it. After the Civil War, no one was under any illusions that the states could say no to the federal government anymore. And that's a very significant change. So that is one of the main things about the 14th Amendment. But let me talk about the other ones. I'm not meaning to keep you here all day with all this talk about the legalities of Reconstruction, but the other element in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment is extremely consequential. It redefines citizenship. Now, it is very important to note that the southern states were strong-armed, blackmailed, had to sit under martial law through a very oppressive regime for years in order to redefine what Americans understood to be citizenship. Previous to the Civil War, every state separately regulated who was eligible for the suffrage. This is a very important point. Every state had a different law about who could vote. And that was because every state was seen to have Republican institutions of its own that it was responsible for ultimately. The 14th Amendment gives us a federal definition of citizenship, and this is a very important one. This is a radical one. This has a lot to do with how American identity has developed over time. We see this law influences American identity in major ways. We are perhaps much more aware of that with our immigration questions today. The first part of the 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. All you need to do to be a citizen is to be born here.
Well, and it's interesting, and this is something that I don't want to fall into this trap, of merely saying, the left doesn't respect the textual basis of the law, because it's obviously true. This has been true, but arguably, ever since the set of amendments, even before that. But if you look at, the construction of the 14th Amendment. It is so clearly not talking about an infinite number of Central and South Americans. It was written with regards to slaves. And I mean, I can dislike the original interpretation of the 14th Amendment, but it's very clearly was not designed for its current application, I guess.
Indeed. This has huge ramifications, of course, and we can never get to the bottom of it. But Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, this is a very long amendment, has to do with changing the way that representation in Congress is apportioned. You may remember from civics, or if you've ever taken, or if you've ever read the Constitution itself, the Constitution is very famous for the 3/5 clause, which has to do with the apportionment of representation in Congress based on population. The 3/5 clause refers to slaves counted for purposes of representation. Because they were not citizens, they were only counted as 3/5. This way, the South had a measure of additional representation based on its slave population. The argument was, of course, that the well-being of the slave population was represented in congressmen just as a father would represent the interests of his wife and children. All right, so we could call it a patriarchal or feudalistic justification in a representative mode. This is, of course, before women's suffrage, and men were seen as representing the interests of their womenfolk in representative institutions, and women were seen as non-political members of society, that they did not have a public role in making law or executing law. And this is actually a very profound point. We know that this is mocked, dismissed. We are so used to the mockery and cynical takes about the exclusion of women, for instance. We tend to mouth them ourselves, or even to fall into patterns of thought when we think about this. Think about it a different way, if you will. The idea was that God has divided humanity into at least two groups, men and women. And women have a special role in society to foster and nurture life, whereas men have a special duty and burden in society to deal out legitimate violence when necessary. All right, men go to war, women stay home. Women are not supposed to shed blood. Women are not supposed to bear arms. All right. Now it's not that they can't in extremis, right? Self-defense or something like that. But the idea is that this is why women do not make laws. This is why women do not execute laws. Women do not have blood on their hands. Women bring life into the world. They are the only members of society that can do that. And that's a different and important way of looking at it. Okay, that's the way they looked at it. But they also said, well, obviously slaves don't take part in politics. Politics involves the dealing out of legitimate violence, among other things. Slaves are just not a part of this. Slaves do not bear arms. Slaves are enthralled to their masters, and their masters look over them. So the 3/5 clause in the Constitution deals out representative the representative apportionment of the states based on the slave population. The second part of the 14th Amendment undoes that, okay? Because now the slaves are all counted as freemen. They are now citizens because of birthright citizenship in the first section. All right, so Section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as any member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may vote of 2/3 of each house to remove such disability. All right. This is specifically to disenfranchise ex-Confederates. If you can prove any of these people have anyone that has held office, um, anyone related to the pre-war government that supported the Confederates in any way, if they've given aid or comfort, okay, that's a very low bar to disenfranchise. This is how the radical Republicans in Congress were going to make sure they were not going to be looking across the aisle at any of their former enemies from the Civil War. And this disenfranchises the leadership class of the South. Okay, the leadership class of the South participated in the war. This is a very consequential thing. Now, and by the way, this is the justification for some of the shenanigans we're seeing today, which I don't mean to get into right now. But this is what the 14th Amendment was written for. It was written to disenfranchise an entire class of people, and it was forced into law through these extreme malevolent ways. All right, by garrisoning black conscripts in southern states to intimidate the population. All right, section 4. We're getting to the end here. The validity of the public debt of the United States, authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. All right, this is because there were plenty of people right after the war saying, well, we've just borrowed an incredible amount of money. They issued paper currency, which acted like treasury bonds. Okay, the paper currency, every single item of paper currency, every artifact of paper currency, the greenbacks issued by Lincoln's government. The first green paper money that we had in the United States, by the way, it was all supposed to be redeemed by the Treasury with lawful money. And lawful money, according to the Constitution, is gold and silver coin. All right. So the greenbacks were a temporary paper currency. And there was a big controversy during Reconstruction about repudiating the greenbacks. Let's just not redeem this stuff. Let's just make it permanent paper currency or do something else. Let's avoid the responsibility of redeeming this stuff. Okay, so the 14th Amendment says, no, we're definitely redeeming this stuff. And we're guaranteeing that everyone that was rewarded in war through payment in the greenbacks, these certificates of future payment, they are definitely going to get their money out of the system, and no one is going to argue about this anymore. The United States will pay its debts. Okay, so the 14th Amendment, and this is something that comes up in conversation every time the government gets shut down. Okay. Again, the 14th Amendment is brought up and says, well, it's the law. The government has to pay its debts. It's part of the fundamental law. It's part of constitutional law that the federal government has to pay its debts. So when we have a budget crisis and the U.S. government is deciding which bills it can afford to pay, it's definitely going to pay the interest on the national debt. It at least constitutionally, unless it violates the Constitution, it has to pay the interest on the debt. But the section goes on. It says, neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave. But all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. All right, so finally, the United States government will not pay any compensation for the end of slavery, and no one is going to be paid for their Confederate bonds. No one will be compensated for Confederate currency. All of that is written off. No debate anymore. So it shuts down these big questions during Reconstruction. But even though this is very consequential in that it destroys an incredible amount of wealth in the South through the stroke of a pen, it's still brought up in conversation today when it comes to the national debt. Lastly, and in conclusion, Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, Congress shall have the power to enforce or appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article. All right, into the 14th Amendment.
Well, I think that we are at time. Might be a good idea to come back if we want to discuss kind of the 15th Amendment and maybe some other parts of Reconstruction, because there's some things that I wanted to bring up, and I mean, I guess this is just a deep topic. But as we've said before, you have a book on the topic that will be linked. I've received my copy. I have not gone through it yet because there's a lot in there. It's incredibly dense, and I got it just a few days ago. But if people want to find more of you and more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yes, indeed. I'm so excited about the publication of this book. I've been working on this book to bring it back into print for a long time, and I'm working on other projects there as well. The book is The Civil War and Reconstruction in Alabama. It's by Walter Linwood Fleming, and it's one of these state-specific histories of Reconstruction. And I've brought it back into print to make it accessible again. You can find it on barnesandnoble.com. Perhaps we can link it in the show notes there. I'll make sure that you have that information. You can find more information about my work. I'm newly on Twitter. I've never been on Twitter before, but I am now, kind of to promote my book. I'm at Tallman Books on Twitter. And I've got a YouTube channel as well. Look up George Bagby on YouTube, and you can find some of my recording there. I record essays, things that interest me. I'm recording a couple of books there right now. I'm recording some C.S. Lewis and some G.K. Chesterton right now.
Well, great. I'm looking forward to that. I've been listening to a lot of your backlog over the holidays. I kind of lost track of it, so I'll be sure to catch those when they drop. As far as my stuff, you guys can find me on any podcatcher. That's Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like watching podcasts. And also, I've been putting out a lot more on Substack, so you can find the Jay Burden Show on Substack as well. I'll be on Aaron's show on Wednesday. That will be the 3rd, I believe, to discuss an article I've written. So if you want to get a look at it before I discuss it live or see some of the other stuff I posted, that's a good way to do that. If you want to support us directly, the best way to do it is Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. A couple of guys in my community have launched the Fat Bastard Challenge, which is free. It's not something I even came up with. Scratchy, who's been on here a couple of times, did, which is essentially a weight loss program for the first quarter of the year. I think it ends sometime in March. Heroic Will and Arthur Dane, who both have been on the show before, are acting as judges. So I'll include a link to that if you want to get in on the action and just do something. It's just accountability. There's no sales or anything to it, but you should do that as well. And again, Bagby, thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure, and I look forward to doing more on Reconstruction with you in the future.
Definitely. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.